Spirit of God is present even when we don't feel him.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
just that it's like air. Air is always here around us. Sometimes it's still, and yet it's still present. Other times the wind is blowing, and we very much feel it. So it was
Yeah.
always there the whole time.
Welcome to the AWI podcast. This is just a time of real and authentic conversations surrounding worship, discussing theology, artistry, and leadership. And so we're so excited for this podcast, we're going to be answering the question of what is worship? Figured as an organization that is focused on worship, it'd be important to define that. And to just answer that question. And so we have the honor of having our guest, Dr. Stephen Martin. He is the chair of music at Bethel University, and he actually was one of my old professors at APU. And he used to be the program director of music studies at APU, and I got to know him a lot through that. And he was the first person who broke my box of defining what worship was. So I figured, what a better person to ask to be a part of this conversation. And he actually was helped build up AWI. And so I don't know if you want to share a little bit about that story and how it came about.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Taylor. It's just a joy to be back in conversation with you and thinking about all the good work that AWI is doing. It's an honor to be with you. So, looking forward to the conversation today. How did AWI get started? I think in some ways, if I'm honest, it probably kind of dropped in my lap, or in our lap, I should say, when I was there at APU. And so we were already doing something called Worship Arts Lab as a camp in the summer through a theology initiative.
Mm.
And so that was really fun to work on. And I remember you were one of the participants, I think, in that. So those are many fond memories. And actually, during the week of that, there was an invitation from Lily saying, would you like to expand this work into a broader initiative really centered around intergenerational worship in the arts? And we want to give you some funding for that. We're happy to help you write the grant proposal. It was a fairly short time frame. And so that summer, I happened to be preparing for my doctoral qualifying exams when this sort of came our way. And so it all happened at once. I was studying for
Mhm.
my qualifying exams and writing a grant in I want to say it was about 6 or 8 weeks.
Dang.
So it was a really fun project to get going and be a part of the, initial phases of it. And now it's so great to see all the work that's coming out of it since.
Yeah. 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 Well, thank you for being a part of the beginning stages and really helping launch it. Because, yeah, I think it's a great initiative. I'm very passionate about it. That's why I work for it. And yeah. So let's get into the conversation. What is worship? I know we're going right for it, but how would you define worship if someone asked you?
Yeah. You know, that is such a big question. And it's a question that I continue to think about and try to think about from different angles, just for the duration. So it's easy to try to pin it down to one sentence or one verse or some sort of initial concept. And I think that's good work to do. Um, for me, the Shema Yisrael in Deuteronomy chapter 6 is a great place to start. Um, God's call to Israel, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And and then, of course, later in Mark 12, Jesus adds the mind when he's quoting the Shema. And so that's an all-encompassing statement. That's every nerve, every fiber, every thought, every
Yeah. Yeah.
action that we take in life. And what a compelling challenge. If worship is complete and full orientation towards the creator of the universe. And that's all of me and everything I have to give, then I can't think of a more compelling challenge than that. And so, as Jesus unpacks that in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and then sort of solidifies it and says, if you can just summarize it down to two little ideas, well, big ideas. Love the Lord your God with everything that
Mm.
you are. Love your neighbor as yourself. And very big ideas that are beautifully succinct the way he puts it and the way the Old Testament first establishes them, but really hard to live out. Like, that's not easy stuff when you actually put it into practice or try to every day. Um, so here we are. We're pursuing that as followers of Christ with everything that we have. And, with his abundance and goodness and love in our lives, we can carry forward in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and you touched on a lot, um, of it biblically and specifically in the New Testament, and what I think is really interesting too is when you go to the Old Testament, the first time worship is mentioned, I believe it's Genesis 22:5, where it's Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham's about to go bring Isaac up to the hill and sacrifice him, and I can specifically read it. It says he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." And I just think that's really interesting to put it in that uh, frame too of he was going to sacrifice Isaac, and yet he was doing what the Lord asked him to do. And like, what is then in that context, what does worship look like too? Of like, is it surrender? Is it like loving the Lord, proving like that you love God more than anything, that you would do something that doesn't quite make sense, but it was what was asked. It was what any way that was any separation that is between you and God, that you would lay that down and close that separation. And I even think back to a class of yours of how you showed us the picture of Adam trying to touch God, and how you even described worship as what closes that gap, what draws you closer to God. And even talking about that picture is really interesting because when you look at it, Adam's like kind of weakly pointing and like isn't fully even like engaged, um, which I think is fascinating. But at the same time, I think worship is so much of closing that gap of I love God, I love people, and how do I close that gap between me and him and me and others, and like that uh, communal aspect as well. Um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that painting of Michelangelo on the top of the Sistine Chapel is so, I think, compelling as well.
Hmm.
And Taylor, part of me wants to say that it may not be named as in the word specifically, but from the very opening verses of Genesis 1, the whole framework of that opening chapter, those opening chapters, seems to be about orienting human nature, human reality
Mm,
toward the creator. Um, and we see stars and moon and day and night and so many of the things in the ancient world that were valued by other cultures to the points of being gods and idolized. Moon, stars, animals, whatever it might be. And then at the close of that chapter and on into the next, the story turns and everything is pointed back towards God as the ultimate source of all things. And in the Catholic tradition, there is a kind of procession that opens up the Catholic Mass as those leading the worship liturgy, the liturgical aspects of the day, process into the space. And then the priest is the final one in. and turns around and points everyone in the room towards God. And the same kind of procession happens in Genesis 1, where all of these things of value are named, but then humans enter the story, Genesis 1:27, made in the image of God, and their whole job in life is to be stewards of all of this and then point all of creation back toward its creator. Um, and then, of course, the whole journey of the Bible is just okay. Now these are real life stories of how difficult this can be, how engaging it can be, how beautiful and communal and life giving and hard and full of lament and sorrow and joy and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and even with what you said of like it's all pointing back to God, and even thinking of that specific picture of like Adam is pointing to God. And so maybe even worship is does it center us back? Does it point us back to God, whether no matter what form? Because today a lot of people when especially in church, oh, the worship was great today, and they're talking about the musical aspect. But I personally believe, and I know you believe, that worship is not just music. And so, how do you go about having that conversation with people?
Hmm. You might remember this from some of our classes. We would do a little bit of myth busting, play Mythbusters for a little bit. And one of the first myths that we would unpack is this idea that music and worship are synonymous. Certainly, music is a subcategory or an avenue or a tool or resource, however you want to think about it, way of connecting with God.
Yeah.
But it's only one of many. And certainly, as a musician and a lover of music, it's one of my primary avenues. Um, and then I'm reminded that for some people, music doesn't really mean a lot. It's not one of their primary avenues, and so there are so many other avenues we have at our disposal that God has given us, and we have a tendency to walk away from worship service and talk about worship as the music, uh, and it's easy to forget that it's so much more than that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I think it can be painting, it can be having conversations like this, and it can be dancing, it can be like it's not limited to any art form. Yet, I would also argue maybe it even goes beyond art forms, because we can list all the different art forms that you can do, and I think that is such worship. But at the same time, like having conversations, sitting with people, in the hard things, like maybe that's all worship as well, if it's drawing and pointing back to God and drawing us closer to Him and closing that gap. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. I love that. Am I being a good neighbor today? Am I
Mm,
sitting with the one who is suffering and journeying with them as Jesus did? He journeyed with people here on earth and then suffering willingly, um, without a sense of despair, which is really quite the juxtaposition because
mm,
we face some really tough stuff in life and it can be easy to despair. So that's one of the things I continue to just marvel at is the incarnation, the
mm,
fact that Jesus, God, was willing to hang out, you know, willing to go to lunch, willing to hang out with some pretty rough people and never forced them, never coerced them, gave them choice. But I'm here, you know, I'm here for it, here for you. And then to go all the way to death and willingly bear a cross, um, knowing there's something on the other side and knowing that resurrection is still coming. You know, death
mm.
is not the end of the story. And so it's uh it's really mind-boggling and beautiful and stunning all at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That even ponders, what if the question of worship is, am I loving well, loving God, loving neighbor, um, and but yet loving is not just like loving isn't is the hard things, is the joyful things, is all the emotions,
Mm.
yet it's the coming just as I am to the situation as well. Because even I think that is what Abraham did too, of like, I'm bringing all that I am and all that I care about right into the situation and I'm laying it at your feet. I'm like surrendering it. Um, and so it being authentic, it being real, it being present in the moment. I mean, Mary versus Martha, like Martha is running around doing all the different things, and Mary is just simply sitting at Jesus's feet. And I mean, Martha was trying to be a good host. She was trying to create a place and a good environment for Jesus, which is valuable and honorable, but she got so caught up in it that she missed his presence. And I think we can even be guilty of that in church, of putting on a good service, but forgetting to actually sit in his presence and worship ourselves, worship God ourselves. And even that concept too of what does it look like to fully step into worship, yes, musically at church or in, but not letting it just be limited to that category. How do we enter into that authentically?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure I could say it any better than that. That was so good. That summary of Mary and Martha, and the parallels maybe for those of us who are responsible in some way for preparing worship gathering times, ministry, moments, even educational and otherwise, and what it's like to prepare, doing our best and due diligence and all of that, while also recognizing when the Mary moment comes and not sort of being in Martha mode to blast right through it and so caught up in all the preparation and all the details. That's challenging. It's really
Yeah,
challenging, I think, as a leader, because we feel the responsibility of the moment and the people sort of on our watch. And yet to realize there's a bigger picture going on here. Those details matter, but the ability to sort of switch gears and not to that we weren't present in the other, you know, busy aspects,
hmm,
maybe present in a different way. I don't know. I still grapple with the tension of those 2.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Because it's like you wanna do it well. You wanna like give God your best, but also recognize that we're humans and like He cares a lot more about where our heart's at than if we did that perfectly.
Mm,
And I think even that reminds me of the tension between structure and spontaneous
mm.
and letting leaving space for the Holy Spirit, but yet also honoring God in preparing. Um, and how do you balance that?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
And all of these kinds of contrasts between, as you said, structured and spontaneous worship, and how I w I would suggest that the Spirit can be present in all of it. All of the
yeah,
structure, all of the preparation, even perhaps as the pastor is preparing a sermon that is meant for 6 months down the road, and the worship pastor is preparing as best they can, um, that God can be present in those moments of preparation and discussion and guidance of the Spirit. Very, very real. And then the freedom when the time comes to allow the structure to emerge, enhanced by, perhaps interrupted by, some movement that is a surprise in the moment.
totally. Yeah, yeah. It's almost like, okay, prepare a place, prepare the space, but then also allow for him to do his work and yes, prepare with him, like in like, okay, Lord, like thinking of next week, what songs does our congregation need to hear? Like if we're thinking musically, um, what songs do the people of this church need to hear? What songs are in congruence with the message that's being spoken? and thinking through all of that intentionally, because I think there's so much that sometimes when we just spontaneously do things, we can miss. Um, I think the Lord can put something on your heart that's powerful, but what if when I intentionally think of something, sometimes I work through the different options and then I'm like, oh, that one was great and would have been great. But because I really thought about it, I picked this one and that one fits even better. And and taking that time to give the Lord that attention to sit with him instead of just going in the moment, and I think he honors the moment, but it's that balance of even, like, our feelings in our head, because even in Christianity, um, it's important to balance the intellect and the heart, because he wants our heart, yet he also wants us to understand, but yet we can't understand him, and so it's like that balance of having a relationship with a God who is personal, yet we can't put him in a box and have like balancing that and even think of like when we think of a friendship or a relationship with a person, we know them through spending time with them, through having conversations, through getting to know them in an intellectual level, but at the same time, like the time spent, the like moments shared, the feelings shared, and like, that you need to spend time with them, and I think that's so much of worship too, of, like, are you spending time? And so much of your own time with the Lord outside of a congregational aspect is important, because if you don't have that own your own personal time and secret place with the Lord, how do you fully enter into leading others too in worship? So I'd even love to talk about the difference of personal worship versus congregational worship,
Mm,
if you wanna
yeah,
expand.
that's a great segue. I think music makes a great analogy for this. So, as musicians, we spend hypothetically many, many hours in a practice room on our own, honing our craft to the best we
Mm,
can. And yet, hours spent alone in a practice room don't emerge as something larger than the sum of its parts because it requires the ensemble. It requires usually interaction with other musicians, at least in a duo or trio or some larger form, and then an audience as a part of that, or those participating. So we can do the solo thing for a while, and some do. But at some point, if no one else is involved, we very much are an island and kind of working in a vacuum
mm.
and missing out on some of the larger other capacities of music. And so there is this individual and corporate communal sense of worship on both levels. And I think a lot about what are the differences between the two. Like in individual worship, times of prayer, times of meditation, solitude, taking a walk out by the lake, uh, reading the Bible on our own. These kinds of moments can be
Yeah.
very individual and wonderful and good in their own right. And sometimes life demands those moments of us. We don't really have a choice. And so God is just as present in those moments. It's not that. It's not the lack of God's presence, but there is also this reality of human existence that we're meant to be living in community with others. And that seems pretty apparent to me. And so, what are the things that we do and can do collectively together in corporate worship settings that might be slightly different than we could do as individuals and vice versa? You know, so some of those moments of silence, solitude, all of that might take on a different shape and form when we're together with a group. It's not that they don't exist, but they just are going to be different in some way. So take Quaker worship, for example. That is silence initially. It begins in silence, and then it may remain in silence for a very long time. So the meditative, contemplative aspects of that can be there. And yet, a moment later, something can erupt in a Quaker service into just outright whatever it is, singing, dancing, um, prophetic kind of moments, teaching moments, whatever. Uh, so it's an interesting kind of dynamic to think about as just a thought experiment and a practice, much less something that's highly organized, take more of an orthodox or some, for lack of a better phrase, more high church, highly structured approach. And those are also different in their own way, but designed towards corporate a bit more than the individual.
Yeah, and there's something, like, even connecting to your music analogy, there's something different about if I were to just sing and play a song by myself, beautiful, I can, like, harmonize with my instrument, but yet there's different harmonies that can be accessed when there's another person joining in. There's different elements of instruments that can be accessed, even different notes when a different instrument joins in and adds something else. There's there's beauty in the simplicity and the just like simple focus of one person singing and playing themselves, but then there's this grander, bigger, almost experience that happens when you are doing music all together. And I think that's similar to of the difference of when I'm worshiping Jesus in my car and I'm just singing to him, it's beautiful, it's special, like that is needed. But there's something different that happens when I am at a church service or like a worship concert or whatever, where we're all singing the same song, but like different people are harmonizing. Like you hear other people's voices, you see other people worshiping. It's like we need that community to encourage our own worship. We need that community to expand our minds and bring up other things, other notes. Like once again, using that music analogy, bringing up those other elements of, if we were to say music, that don't happen when we're just by ourselves. And same thing in worship and even in conversations of there's things that you've said just in this conversation that I wouldn't have said on my own. And you sparked different things in my brain that I wouldn't have gotten to on my own. And that's the communal aspect that we need. Like it's not good for man to be alone. It's not good for him to just be in a vacuum in a single room all by himself all the time. Like we go crazy. And someone, I mean, God himself is triune. He is three in one. He has different aspects and different points to him. And that's already set up that way. So if we're made in the image of God, what more do we need other people? What more do we need that communal relationship?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting to think about it that way. I
Mhm,
I wonder, like, going back to the beginning of our conversation, this sort of attempt that we naturally make to try to define something, to try to pin it to some
mm,
phrase or words that gives us a concise way of understanding it. And that's all well and good. I think that's a needed exercise for us. And at the same time, it's something more than we can put into words. And music, I think, can help us again, kind of with that, because there's something we know, we feel, we sense when a really wonderful moment in music is happening. Sometimes we're a part of the group that's performing, or we're in the audience, or experiencing it through a movie or something. And you can't quite put a finger on it, and yet it's powerful. It's just something really dynamic and beautiful. And so that transcendence, we might say, experiencing the divine in a moment in ways that are particularly unique to that moment.
mhm,
Augustine had this phrase he used, si comprehendus nanus deus. And for him, that meant if you can comprehend it, then that's not God,
mm,
because God is beyond comprehension. And yet, able to be, we might say, apprehended, able to be experienced.
yeah.
So somehow the interplay of all of that, music allows us to see something beautiful and dynamic and powerful that emerges well beyond the sum of its parts. communal corporate worship. Similarly, and even more so, um, and uh, the Spirit of God. I think it's not that the Spirit of God is not present in all of the moments, even when we don't. Spirit of God is present even when we don't feel Him.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
just that it's like air. Air is always here around us. Sometimes it's still, and yet it's still present. Other times the wind is blowing, and we very much feel it. So it was
Yeah.
always there the whole time.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I love that, and I love that analogy of, like, the air and the wind because, yeah, God is always present, and I even worship shouldn't just be in those specific moments, like, worship is a lifestyle. And, like, not trying to define it, but I think, once again, it's yeah, it's if we're trying to worship a God who we can't put in a box, then who are we to even try to define worship and what it looks like to worship a God we can't put in a box? Because then worship itself can't be put in a box. And I think worship is in the mundane and the big moments. It's in everything. It's we are called to worship Him through our work, through our like through everything that we do, everything that we put our hand to, and so just like air, He's present in all of that. It's almost like, but do we recognize Him? Do we like recognize that, oh, even though I know I'm breathing in air, I forget because He is so intelligently designed our bodies that it just occurs and we don't even think twice. But yet, what would happen if we were conscious of, hey, I have the Holy Spirit inside of me, and we can do this together. Like you gave me a helper, and I can talk to you, I can pray to you, like you hear me, and like all these things, even even in the mundane, even in making coffee in the morning, even in going for a walk and spending more intentional time, but then also like the more non-intentional, like, hey, as I take a breath, do I recognize that the Lord is with me? And even thinking of Yahweh, that is that is actually breath. Like Yahweh is like how we breathe, like He's in our breath. And so along with that air analogy, He is in the breath. Like He is the
Mm.
one that breathes life into us. Like He created us from dust and then He breathed in us, and that is what gave us life. And becoming conscious of how present He is, and then what the more that makes us want to worship Him because he's the air we're breathing. He is the reason all this exists.
Acts 17:28. Paul is in Greece speaking to those at the Areopagus. This is the God in whom we live and move and have our being.
Mm.
Right now.
So good. As we come to a close, taking into consideration everything that we discussed, what is something, a soundbite, a golden nugget, something, some takeaway that you would like to leave people with surrounding worship?
Oh man, I'm just enjoying this conversation. Thanks for being a dialogue partner today. This was great.
Mhm.
Um, I think one of the first things I would say for myself is that I want to continue to be a student of it, student of worship,
Mm,
and a student of what it means to be fully oriented toward God. That phrase from Paul, if this really is the God in whom we all live and move and have our being, what does that mean for me? What does it mean for my neighbor? What does it mean for the people I'm walking with and who are walking with me? People I haven't met yet, people I need to be open to, um, and continuing to expand my understanding. Um, Took me a long time to realize that lament is a part of worship, and it's a major part of Israel's hymn book in the Psalms. And so when I feel at ill at ease, or when my friend or family member is suffering, and they are feeling that lament in their life, sorrow, grief, pain, and they're reaching out to God in the midst of that. That's worship. So if the nation of Israel was named after Jacob when his name was changed from Jacob to Israel, and if Israel means the one who wrestles with God through all of it, then what does that really mean? What does that really look like? Um, so that's, I think, one thought for me, and the other thought that I have been pondering lately is, in this effort to define things, trying to flip it around sometimes and ask the question, what is the capacity of this thing?
Hmm.
So in this case, we're talking about worship. So what is the capacity of worship? Which I am terribly fascinated by,
Yeah.
both at the individual level, the corporate level, when people are fully oriented toward God, reorienting towards God. It's a daily, sometimes minute by minute endeavor. And so, what is the capacity of that? Have we truly seen what that capacity is in our lifetime?
Yeah, worship is beyond so much more of what we can ever define, um, but how sweet it is to continue to learn more and more as we learn more and more about God, to learn more and more, like, what worship looks like, the different aspects of it, and yeah, yeah. Dr. Martin, thank you so much for your time and for this conversation. Thank you for the wisdom that you brought to this conversation biblically and from your own life experience. It was an honor and a privilege to get to talk about this with you.
Thanks, Taylor. The honor was all mine. So, thanks for the conversation.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of our podcast. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Stephen Martin as we attempted to define worship. If you liked our conversation, go ahead and click that like button on this video and subscribe to our channel for more. In 2 weeks, we will be talking about songwriting as another avenue of worship. Hope to see you then. Thanks!